There was a moment where everything in you wanted to react. Your mind was racing, your emotions were rising, your ego was ready to defend itself. You could have spoken, you could have corrected them, you could have proved your point, and if you had, nothing would have changed. It would have been the same pattern, the same escalation, the same exhausting loop, but you didn't. You stayed silent, and that silence did something far more powerful than any argument ever could. It shifted the balance, it transferred pressure, it exposed intention, it recalibrated perception, and the person who thought they had control suddenly felt it slipping. Most people believe power is loud. They believe dominance requires reaction. They believe silence means weakness. But what if the exact opposite is true? What if the moment you refused to react was the moment reality started responding differently to you? What if your silence wasn't avoidance, but activation? Today, we're breaking down the 7 powerful shifts that happened the second you chose control over impulse. Because you didn't lose that moment, you mastered it. And when you master yourself, everything around you begins to move differently. Let's talk about what really happened. 1. Silence is not passive, it is power under control. There is a dangerous misconception that silence equals weakness. From childhood, most people are conditioned to believe that strength means speaking up immediately, defending yourself instantly, responding quickly, proving your point before the other person finishes theirs. Reaction is praised, volume is mistaken for dominance, emotional intensity is confused with conviction. But real power is not immediate. Real power is restrained. When you didn't respond, something extraordinary happened. You interrupted the script. Understand this clearly. Most social interactions run on prediction. People expect certain reactions from you. They know what irritates you. They know what triggers you. They know what words will pull you into defense mode. They push a button and they expect movement. That expectation gives them a sense of control. The moment you refuse to move on command, control shifts. Silence is not empty. Silence is controlled energy, and controlled energy is dangerous to anyone who relies on provoking you to feel powerful. When someone throws an emotional hook and you don't bite, the hook hangs in the air. It doesn't land. It doesn't connect. The person who threw it suddenly feels exposed. Their attempt to direct the situation fails. And here's the deeper truth. Reaction is surrender. The second you react automatically, you prove that someone else can dictate your emotional state. You become predictable. Predictability lowers authority. But restraint builds presence. When you paused instead of reacting, you demonstrated something far more intimidating than anger. You demonstrated awareness. Awareness says, I see what you're doing. Control says, and I choose not to participate. That choice changes the entire energetic hierarchy of the moment. Most people operate on impulse. They speak from wounded ego. They defend from insecurity. They argue from fear of losing position. But when you stayed silent, you rose above impulse. You moved from instinct to intention. And intention is where power lives. Think about it carefully. It takes no strength to explode. It takes enormous strength to remain composed when your emotions are being tested. Anyone can shout. Very few can stand still. And stillness is unsettling. Why? Because stillness forces the other person to confront themselves. Without your reaction to bounce off of, they are left alone with their own energy, their own words, their own tone. You become the immovable object in the room, and immovable objects command gravity. Silence also protects your position. The moment you argue excessively, you lower your stance. You signal that you need validation. You signal that you require acknowledgement. You signal insecurity. But when you remain quiet, you communicate something powerful without saying a word. I do not need to convince you. That message carries more authority than any defense ever could. Understand something deeper. Emotional control is not suppression, it is mastery. Suppression is when you stay silent but burn internally. Mastery is when you stay silent because you genuinely understand that reaction is unnecessary. One is tension, the other is dominance. In that moment, you chose stillness. You were not avoiding conflict, you were assessing it. You were deciding whether the situation deserved your energy. And that decision alone elevates you, because energy is currency. Every reaction costs you. Every emotional spike drains you. When you withheld that currency, you kept your wealth. And people feel that. Calm composure in a heated moment is rare. It signals internal stability. It signals self-trust. It signals that your identity is not fragile. Fragile identities react. Solid identities observe. The person who cannot provoke you cannot control you. Let that sink in. Control over self is the highest form of control available to you. Not control over others, not control over circumstances, control over self. When you stayed silent, you exercised the rarest discipline. You refused to let external forces dictate your internal state, and that refusal shifts dynamics in ways most people cannot see. You didn't just avoid a fight, you altered perception, you altered authority. You altered the unspoken hierarchy of the interaction, because the person who controls themselves controls the atmosphere, and atmosphere controls outcomes. That moment of silence, it was not emptiness. It was strength under precision. It was power without noise. It was control without performance, and that is why silence is never passive. It is power under command. 2. Reaction feeds loops. Stillness breaks them. Most people don't realize they are living inside loops. Emotional loops, argument loops, validation loops, conflict loops. Someone says something, you react. They react to your reaction. You escalate. They defend. You push harder, back and forth, round and round. It feels like movement, but it's not progress. It's repetition, and repetition drains power. Every emotional reaction reinforces the loop. It confirms the pattern. It strengthens the cycle. The more you react, the more predictable the cycle becomes. The more predictable it becomes, the easier it is to keep you inside it. Reaction feeds the machine. Think about how arguments usually unfold. They don't explode out of nowhere. They build because both sides keep supplying energy. Each reaction becomes fuel. Each emotional spike adds momentum. The loop survives on participation. The moment you refuse to participate, something radical happens. The loop collapses. When you didn't respond, you removed fuel from the fire. The energy thrown at you had nowhere to land. It couldn't bounce back. It couldn't escalate. It couldn't evolve into something bigger. It stalled, and stalled energy feels uncomfortable to the person who initiated it. Silence is disruptive because it interrupts rhythm. Every interaction has a rhythm. Attack and defend, trigger and react, push and pull. People become accustomed to this rhythm. They expect it. They rely on it. When you stay still, the rhythm breaks, and broken rhythm creates psychological instability for the other person. They expected movement. They expected resistance. They expected engagement. Instead, they got nothing, and nothing is disorienting. Understand this clearly. Emotional loops thrive on urgency. They convince you that you must respond immediately. That silence equals loss. That hesitation equals weakness. That not defending yourself equals defeat. But urgency is often manipulation. Stillness creates space, and space creates clarity. In that space, the emotional charge weakens. What felt urgent seconds ago begins to look unnecessary. What felt like an attack begins to look like projection. What felt like a crisis begins to look like noise. You didn't just stay silent. You stepped outside the system. That is what most people cannot do. They operate inside emotional gravity. They feel pulled into reaction because the energy feels heavy, immediate, demanding. But when you step back instead of stepping in, you remove yourself from gravity, and once you are outside the pull, you see the structure clearly. You see that most arguments are not about truth. They are about control. They are about ego. They are about unresolved insecurity trying to find validation. Reaction keeps those structures alive. Stillness exposes them. The moment you did not react, the other person lost leverage. They could not escalate the loop. They could not push you into defense. They could not predict your next move. Unpredictability is power, and non-reaction creates unpredictability. It forces the other person to confront their own behavior without distraction. There is no counterattack to focus on, no argument to chase, no drama to amplify, just silence. And silence acts like a mirror. In that mirror, people see themselves more clearly. Some don't like what they see. This is why stillness often feels heavier than shouting. It shifts pressure. When you argue, you share pressure. When you stay silent, the pressure transfers. Now the other person has to sit with what they said, sit with the tone they used, sit with the intention behind it, sit with the fact that you did not move. And sitting with one's own energy is uncomfortable. That discomfort creates doubt. Doubt creates recalibration. Recalibration creates change, but none of that happens if you react. If you had responded emotionally, the loop would have continued. It would have grown louder, more complicated, more entangled, more words, more misunderstandings, more damage. Instead, you cut the cycle at its root. Breaking a loop is not passive, it is strategic. It requires awareness strong enough to resist impulse. It requires discipline strong enough to withstand temporary discomfort. It requires confidence strong enough to trust that silence is not defeat. You did not ignore the situation. You neutralized it. And neutrality in the face of provocation is unsettling, because when someone cannot move you, they lose the illusion that they control the narrative. You stepped out of the emotional echo chamber, and once you step out, you realize something important. Most loops only exist because both sides keep feeding them. You stopped feeding it, so it starved. That is why stillness is not empty. It is interruption. It is disruption. It is the conscious decision to end repetition instead of continuing it. And when you break a loop, you don't just end a moment, you end a pattern. That is why the silence mattered, because you didn't just avoid reacting, you changed the trajectory of what would have followed. 3. Detachment shifts authority. There is a hidden law operating beneath every interaction you have, whether you notice it or not. Whoever needs the outcome more holds less power. Need is loud, need is anxious, need is reactive. Authority, on the other hand, is calm. The moment you stopped trying to control what would happen next, you stepped into something most people never experience: detachment. And detachment is not indifference, it is internal stability. When you didn't respond, when you didn't chase clarification, when you didn't rush to defend your image or protect your ego, you communicated something without saying a word. I am not dependent on this outcome. That message changes everything, because dependence lowers position. If you desperately need someone to understand you, you are beneath their validation. If you desperately need someone to approve of you, you are beneath their judgment. If you desperately need someone to stay, you are beneath their decision. But when you detach, you rise. Detachment says, I know who I am, whether you recognize it or not, and that certainty is magnetic. People can sense when you are anchored in yourself. They can feel when your emotional state is not tied to their behavior. It creates an invisible shift in authority. Most people try to gain control by force, arguing harder, explaining longer, proving more aggressively. But real authority does not argue. It observes, it allows, it decides whether something deserves engagement. When you stayed silent, you removed urgency from the situation. You removed the pressure to win. You removed the pressure to be right. And that absence of pressure is intimidating. Why? Because the person on the other side expected movement. They expected effort. They expected emotional energy. Instead, they felt distance. And distance creates imbalance. When someone realizes they cannot shake you, cannot rush you, cannot pull you into their emotional storm, something inside them recalibrates. They begin to question their position. They begin to feel the shift. The power dynamic quietly flips. You must understand something critical. Authority is not granted by others. It is projected from within. If your emotional state is easily disturbed, your authority is fragile. If your self-image collapses under criticism, your authority is unstable. If your mood depends on someone else's approval, your authority is conditional. But when you detach, you remove conditions. You are no longer negotiating for respect. You are embodying it, and embodiment is far stronger than demand. There is also something deeper happening beneath detachment. When you release the need to control the narrative, you demonstrate trust, not in the other person, but in yourself. You trust that your value is not up for debate. You trust that your silence will not diminish you. You trust that outcomes will unfold without force. That level of internal confidence is rare, and rarity commands attention. People are accustomed to resistance. They know how to handle defensiveness. They know how to argue with aggression. They know how to manipulate insecurity. But they do not know how to destabilize someone who is centered. Centered individuals do not chase. They do not over-explain. They do not scramble to fix perception. They remain steady, and steadiness creates gravity. Gravity pulls things toward it. When you detached, you became the gravitational force instead of the one orbiting someone else's reaction. The irony is powerful. The less you tried to hold the situation, the more stable you appeared. The less you clung to control, the more control you gained. Detachment removes desperation, and desperation is the quickest way to lose leverage. Think about moments when someone argues intensely. Their voice rises, their explanations multiply, their tone sharpens. They are fighting for position. Now imagine someone who simply listens, says little, and remains calm. Which one feels more grounded? Which one feels more in command? Authority rarely shouts, it stands. Your silence wasn't just composure, it was positioning. You repositioned yourself from participant to observer, from reactive to selective, from controlled to controlling, not controlling others, controlling yourself. And self-control is the foundation of all authority. When you do not need to win the argument, you win the atmosphere. When you do not need to prove yourself, you prove your stability. When you do not need validation, you project confidence. Detachment does not mean you do not care. It means you care enough about your energy to protect it. It means you refuse to lower yourself into unnecessary turbulence. It means you understand that not every battle deserves your presence, and that understanding elevates you, because those who are secure do not scramble, they choose, and choice is power. In that moment, when you did not react, you were not withdrawing, you were ascending. You shifted from emotional survival mode to emotional command. You stopped trying to manage perception, and instead, you managed yourself. That shift is subtle, but it is transformative, because once you detach from needing an outcome, outcomes begin gravitating toward you differently. People respect what they cannot shake. They value what does not beg. They pursue what does not chase. Your silence communicated stability. Your detachment communicated strength, and strength that does not need to announce itself is the most powerful kind. That is why the moment you let go, authority quietly moved in your direction. 4. Emotional mastery rewrites identity. Most people think identity is something fixed, a label, a personality trait, a collection of habits. But identity is not static. It is reinforced moment by moment, especially in high-pressure situations. Who you are is not defined when everything is calm. It is defined when something tries to move you, when someone challenges you, when someone disrespects you, when someone doubts you, when someone tries to provoke you. Those moments are identity checkpoints, and most people fail them without realizing it. They react automatically, they defend instantly, they explode predictably, and every time they do, they reinforce the same version of themselves. Reactive, triggered, dependent on external validation. Identity grows stronger through repetition. If you react the same way every time, that reaction becomes who you are, not because it's true, but because it's practiced. But something different happened this time. You didn't react, and that interruption did more than change the moment. It disrupted your identity. When you stayed silent, you refused to reinforce the old version of yourself. You refused to confirm the pattern. You refused to play the role. That is not small, that is transformative. Because identity is built on emotional memory. When you lose control in an argument, your brain records that pattern. The next time something similar happens, it retrieves the same response faster. But when you override the impulse, when you pause instead of react, you create a new neural imprint. You create a new version of yourself, and the brain pays attention to unusual behavior. It recognizes, this is different. That difference becomes growth. The old identity depended on reaction. The new identity depends on control, and control changes self-perception. The moment you handled that situation with stillness, you saw yourself differently. You realized something powerful. I am not as fragile as I thought. That realization reshapes confidence, because confidence is not built from winning arguments. It is built from mastering yourself. Anyone can dominate a conversation. Very few can dominate their own emotions, and emotional dominance is quiet. It doesn't announce itself. It just exists. When you stayed silent, you experienced something subtle but profound. You felt the urge to react. You felt the emotional surge. You felt the impulse, and you overrode it. That override rewrote the internal script. Instead of, I must defend myself, it became, I choose whether this deserves my energy. That shift is identity evolution. Most people operate on autopilot. They believe their reactions are their personality, but reactions are habits, and habits can be broken. In that moment of restraint, you broke one. You stepped out of emotional autopilot and into conscious authorship. You stopped being the character in the story. You became the writer, and writers control narrative. This is why emotional mastery feels powerful. It changes how you see yourself. You begin to realize you are not controlled by external stimuli. You are not at the mercy of someone else's tone, words, or behavior. You are stable. You are deliberate. You are centered. That internal shift radiates outward because identity shapes posture. Identity shapes tone. Identity shapes decision-making. When you believe you are someone who cannot be easily moved, you carry yourself differently. You speak differently. You engage differently. And others feel it. People treat you based on the identity you project. If you project volatility, they treat you cautiously or dismissively. If you project insecurity, they test you. If you project stability, they respect distance. Your silence began constructing a new identity, one that cannot be easily provoked, one that does not scramble for validation, one that does not collapse under pressure. And once identity changes, reality responds. Because reality interacts with who you believe you are. If you see yourself as someone who must defend constantly, you attract situations that challenge you. If you see yourself as someone grounded and unshakable, you navigate situations differently. You choose differently. You tolerate differently. You walk away differently, and those differences compound. Emotional mastery is not suppression. Suppression hides emotion, but leaves it unresolved. Mastery acknowledges emotion but refuses to be ruled by it. You did not deny what you felt. You decided what to do with it. That decision marks maturity, and maturity marks elevation. When you stayed silent, you were not losing your voice. You were strengthening your core. The core is where identity lives, and the stronger the core, the less the surface can disturb you. That is why this moment mattered more than it appeared. It wasn't about the argument. It wasn't about the words. It was about the version of you that showed up. And the version that showed up was different, more stable, more controlled, more intentional. That is growth. Not loud growth, not dramatic growth, but foundational growth. And foundational growth changes everything that comes next. Because once you become someone who does not react impulsively, you cannot go back to being easily moved. The old identity weakens, the new one strengthens, and that strengthening becomes your new standard. You didn't just win a moment, you upgraded yourself, and upgrades change outcomes. That is why emotional mastery is not just a skill. It is identity transformation in real time. 5. Stillness creates psychological pressure. Most people think silence removes pressure. It doesn't. It transfers it. In an argument, in tension, in confrontation, pressure usually lives in the person who feels the need to respond. The one defending, the one explaining, the one proving, the one trying to restore balance. When you speak quickly, you relieve that pressure. When you argue back, you release it. When you justify yourself, you discharge it. But when you stayed silent, you didn't release anything. You held it, and that changed the atmosphere completely. Because silence does not dissolve tension, it concentrates it. When someone throws words at you expecting resistance, and you offer none, something destabilizing happens. The energy they projected doesn't disappear. It lingers, it hangs, it echoes. And the person who initiated it begins to feel exposed. Why? Because conflict needs two participants to distribute weight. Remove one participant, and all the weight shifts to the other side. That weight is psychological pressure. When you didn't react, you forced the other person to sit alone with what they said. There was no distraction, no counterattack, no argument to chase, no emotional chaos to hide behind. Just their words, just their behavior, just the silence. Silence acts like a spotlight. It highlights everything. Tone becomes louder, intent becomes clearer, aggression becomes obvious. Without your reaction to blur the scene, the focus sharpens, and that sharpness creates discomfort. People are used to shared tension. They are used to emotional exchanges that balance themselves through noise. But stillness creates imbalance, and imbalance creates introspection. The mind begins to replay the interaction. Why didn't they respond? Did I go too far? Did they not care? Are they above this? Uncertainty creeps in, and uncertainty is heavy. When someone cannot read you, they begin to question themselves. When someone cannot move you, they begin to evaluate their position. When someone cannot provoke you, they begin to feel smaller. You did not attack. You did not threaten. You did not dominate. You simply withheld reaction, and that withholding created gravity. Think carefully about this. If you had reacted emotionally, the narrative would have shifted toward the chaos. Both sides would share responsibility. Both sides would feel justified. But when only one person escalates and the other remains composed, the imbalance is undeniable. Observers notice. The aggressor notices. Even the person who initiated the conflict feels the asymmetry. And asymmetry breeds self-awareness. Silence also removes immediate feedback. In arguments, people often rely on your reaction to measure their impact. They want confirmation that their words landed. They want to see anger, frustration, defense. Your reaction validates their power. But when you gave them nothing, you removed validation. That absence is unsettling because without validation, they cannot confirm control. Control thrives on reaction. When reaction disappears, control weakens. And weakened control creates psychological pressure. The pressure builds in subtle ways. They may replay the moment later. They may rethink their tone. They may feel regret. They may feel insecurity. They may feel curiosity. All because you did not fill the space. Silence creates space, and space amplifies thought. When there is no noise, the mind grows louder. And in that louder internal space, reflection begins. This is why stillness can feel more dominant than aggression. Aggression demands attention. Stillness commands it. You did not fight for power. You allowed the imbalance to reveal itself. That is strategic strength. Because real power is not about overpowering someone. It is about standing firm enough that they feel their own instability. When you stayed silent, you communicated several things at once. I am not threatened. I do not need to defend. I am not desperate to win. Each of those signals increases psychological weight on the other side, and the heavier the weight, the more likely recalibration becomes. There is also another layer. When you react emotionally, you expose vulnerability in an uncontrolled way. But when you stay silent, you reveal nothing. You become unreadable, unpredictable, unshaken, and unpredictability creates caution. People tread more carefully around those they cannot read. They hesitate before provoking again. They reconsider before escalating, because silence signals boundaries without announcement. It says, I will not engage at this level, and boundaries create structure. Structure creates respect, even if it is silent respect. The most powerful part of psychological pressure is that it works long after the moment ends. Noise fades quickly, arguments dissolve, but silence lingers. It echoes in memory. It resurfaces at night. It invites reflection, and reflection changes behavior. You didn't have to lecture. You didn't have to threaten consequences. You didn't have to assert dominance. You let stillness do the work, and stillness is patient. It allows time to apply weight. That weight reshapes perception, reshapes hierarchy, reshapes dynamics. You may not have seen it immediately, but something shifted in that silence. Not outwardly loud, but internally powerful. Because when you hold your ground without force, you demonstrate control. And control creates gravity. Gravity creates pressure, and pressure creates change. You didn't escalate. You didn't defend. You didn't relieve tension. You allowed it to sit, and in sitting, it transformed. That is why your silence was not empty. It was heavy, and heavy silence moves people more than loud reactions ever could. 6. Non-reaction is a filter. Most people think silence ends a moment. It doesn't. It reveals it. When you don't react, you create space wide enough for truth to step forward, and truth behaves very differently when it's not being interrupted. Reaction muddies intention. Silence clarifies it. When someone provokes you and you immediately respond, the situation becomes about the exchange, the back and forth, the escalation, the drama. But when you stay still, The spotlight remains on the original action, and that is where character becomes visible. Non-reaction is not avoidance, it is filtration. It filters out performance, it filters out manipulation, it filters out emotional theatrics. Because once you refuse to participate in the emotional exchange, the other person has two options: escalate or expose themselves. If they escalate, they reveal insecurity. If they calm down, they reveal awareness. If they double down, they reveal ego. If they withdraw, they reveal intention. You don't have to interrogate anyone. Silence does the interrogation for you. This is what most people never understand. When you react, you give someone the opportunity to hide inside your response. They can blame your tone. They can deflect onto your reaction. They can claim mutual fault. But when you don't react, there is nowhere to hide. Their behavior stands alone, uncovered, unbalanced, unprotected. That is filtering. You didn't argue to discover their character. You allowed their character to reveal itself. And revelation is more accurate than explanation. Words can be crafted. Reactions can be justified. But behavior under silence becomes honest. There's also something psychologically powerful about being unreadable. When you react, people learn your triggers. They map your emotional landscape. They identify which buttons move you. And once they know your buttons, they know how to control you. But when you refuse to react predictably, you erase the map. You become harder to manipulate, harder to anticipate, harder to destabilize. Non-reaction creates mystery, and mystery creates caution. People move carefully around what they cannot predict, and careful behavior exposes true motives. Think about how often people test boundaries. They push slightly, they observe your reaction, they adjust. Most of this happens subconsciously, but when you remove reaction, you interrupt that testing process. They push, nothing happens. They push again, still nothing. Now they are unsure, and uncertainty forces authenticity. Because without predictable feedback, performance collapses, the mask slips, the real intention emerges. This is why silence feels uncomfortable to others. It removes feedback, and humans rely heavily on feedback. We adjust based on how others respond, but when the response is neutral, contained, or absent, it creates introspection. They begin to ask themselves questions instead of asking you for validation. Did I cross a line? Are they unaffected? Did I misjudge them? That internal questioning is filtration in action. You didn't need to correct them. You didn't need to educate them. You didn't need to defend yourself. You simply observed. And observation is powerful because it is selective. When you choose not to engage, you are also choosing what deserves your energy. That choice is a filter. Not every comment qualifies. Not every opinion deserves access. Not every provocation earns participation. Your silence communicated a boundary without announcement. And boundaries expose alignment. Some people respect them, some challenge them, some retreat, some adapt. Each reaction reveals who belongs in your orbit. Because silence is not about punishment, it's about discernment. You are not withdrawing emotionally. You are evaluating energetically. Who can handle your composure? Who becomes threatened by it? Who escalates when ignored? Who matures when confronted with stillness? You learn more from someone's reaction to your silence than from their words during your argument. Silence also filters your own impulses. It shows you how much control you actually have. It reveals whether you can tolerate discomfort, whether you can resist ego, whether you can stay grounded under pressure. So the filtering works in both directions. It exposes them and it strengthens you. There's something deeply empowering about realizing you don't have to respond to everything, that you don't owe explanation to every challenge, that you don't have to correct every misunderstanding, because constant correction signals insecurity. Selective engagement signals confidence, and confidence filters chaos. Over time, people begin to understand something about you. You are not easily moved. You are not easily baited. You are not easily shaken, and that awareness changes how they approach you. The ones who thrive on drama drift away. The ones who respect boundaries stay. The ones who were testing you stop testing. Because you removed reinforcement. Non-reaction is refinement. It trims excess noise from your environment. It separates the impulsive from the intentional, the insecure from the stable, the manipulative from the sincere. And it does all of this without confrontation, without accusation, without spectacle, just through controlled stillness. That is strategic calm. You didn't disengage because you were weak. You disengaged because you were evaluating. And evaluation is power, because when you filter carefully, what remains around you becomes aligned. Less chaos, less manipulation, less emotional noise, more clarity, more respect, more stability. Silence is not absence, it is selection. You selected peace over impulse. You selected discernment over reaction, and that selection quietly reshaped your environment. That is why non-reaction is not passive. It is precise, it is intentional, it is filtering reality in real time. And once you understand that, you will never feel the need to react impulsively again. 7. The moment you stayed silent, you shifted timelines. Every decision branches reality. Most of those branches are small, invisible, forgettable, but some moments are pressure points, moments where one reaction would have pulled you into chaos, and another response quietly rerouted your entire trajectory. You think your silence was just restraint. It wasn't. It was redirection. Understand this. Every reaction creates consequences, not just emotional ones, relational ones, professional ones, psychological ones. If you had reacted with anger, you would have escalated tension. That escalation would have created new friction. That friction would have created distance. That distance would have influenced future interactions. Chain reaction. But you didn't react, and because you didn't, the chain never formed. Most people underestimate how much damage one impulsive response can create. A single heated message, a single emotional outburst, a single desperate explanation. Those moments become turning points. You avoided one. That is not small. You interrupted a timeline that would have reinforced chaos. Think about it carefully. Had you reacted, you might have confirmed someone's negative perception of you. You might have validated their narrative. You might have strengthened their belief that you are unstable, reactive, emotional. Instead, you contradicted it, and contradictions create cognitive disruption. When someone expects volatility and receives composure, they must reevaluate their assumptions. That reevaluation shifts how they see you moving forward. You didn't just avoid damage, you upgraded perception. Perception influences opportunity. Opportunity influences direction. Direction influences outcome. That's how timelines shift. It doesn't look dramatic. There's no explosion, no visible collapse, just a quiet recalibration. The most powerful changes are rarely loud. They happen internally first, externally later. When you chose silence, you stepped into a higher version of yourself, and higher versions experience different outcomes. If you remain reactive, you continue attracting reactive environments. If you remain defensive, you continue attracting confrontation. But when you become composed, stable, deliberate, your decisions start filtering your future. You walk away earlier. You engage selectively. You tolerate less. You respond strategically. Each of those shifts alters what comes next. Most people repeat the same emotional patterns for years. Same arguments, same dynamics, same endings, because they respond the same way every time. You broke repetition, and breaking repetition breaks destiny patterns. You may not see it immediately, but the moment you chose not to escalate, you prevented long-term erosion. Relationships are not destroyed in one moment. They erode through repeated impulsive reactions. You prevented erosion. You preserved stability. Even if the situation eventually dissolves, it will not dissolve because you lost control. It will dissolve because it reached its natural conclusion. There is dignity in that. There is power in that. You also preserve something even more important, your internal trajectory. Every time you lose control, your confidence fractures slightly. Every time you react impulsively, you reinforce the belief that you are emotionally fragile. But when you remain composed under pressure, your self-trust grows. And self-trust changes how boldly you move in life. You begin to realize, I can handle pressure. I don't collapse when challenged. I am not controlled by emotion. That realization strengthens decision-making across all areas of your life, not just conflict, work, relationships, opportunities, negotiations, leadership. When you trust your stability, you take smarter risks. You speak with more certainty. You move with more intention. That is timeline shifting, not mystical, not dramatic, strategic. You also avoided something invisible: regret. How many times have people wished they could take words back? How many nights are spent replaying reactions? How much mental energy is drained by wishing you had stayed calm? You bypassed that spiral. No replay, no guilt, no self-criticism, just composure. That composure compounds, and compounded composure builds authority. Over time, people begin to treat you differently. They approach you with more caution, more respect, more awareness, because you demonstrated something rare: stability under provocation. That reputation follows you, and reputation shapes access. Access shapes possibility. Possibility shapes destiny. You think your silence was a single moment. It wasn't. It was a pivot, a quiet pivot. Most life changes do not announce themselves. They are built through small, controlled decisions that accumulate power. You accumulated power. You avoided emotional debt. You protected perception. You strengthened identity. You shifted momentum. And momentum is everything. Once momentum shifts toward composure, future conflicts become easier to manage. Future provocations lose intensity, because you know you can withstand them. That confidence alters posture, tone, presence. People sense it, and they adjust accordingly. You did not just survive the moment, you elevated through it. And elevation always creates separation. Separation from old patterns, from old reactions, from old versions of yourself. The person who would have reacted no longer leads. The person who chooses deliberately now does. That is the shift. Not loud, not flashy, but foundational. You change direction, and direction determines destination. You didn't respond, and because you didn't, the future rearranged itself quietly around your restraint. That is how timelines move, not through chaos, through control. So understand this clearly. You didn't stay silent because you were weak. You stayed silent because you were aware. You felt the pull to react, and you overrode it. You felt the urge to defend, and you chose restraint. You felt the tension, and you held your ground. That is not suppression. That is mastery. Most people will never realize how many opportunities they lose because they cannot control a single emotional impulse. You controlled yours, and that changes everything. Because once you prove to yourself that you cannot be easily moved, you begin to move differently. You speak with more certainty. You choose your battles more carefully. You stop explaining yourself to people who never intended to understand you. And the world responds to that stability. Respect shifts, energy shifts, opportunities shift. Not because you forced anything, but because you stopped being reactive. Silence is not the absence of power. It is power under discipline. And the moment you mastered that discipline, you stepped into a higher version of yourself. The kind that doesn't chase, the kind that doesn't break, the kind that doesn't need to prove. If this message resonated with you, it's because you're already evolving. You're learning that the loudest victories are often silent, and sometimes the biggest shift in your life begins with one simple decision: to not react, stay steady, stay aware. And remember, the moment you control yourself, you control the direction of everything that follows.